Everyone always talks about how the SEC is the top conference in college football, and with those expectations comes a lot of pressure for SEC quarterbacks. In today's video, we're going to go through each and every SEC quarterback, go through their preseason hype, talk about how they've done, and ultimately give them a grade for their season performance. We have 3 weeks left of the regular season, so it's safe to say we have a good idea of how good most of these quarterbacks are. But before we get started, we're just under 5,000 subscribers away from 100K, so be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support the channel, turn on notifications so you never miss when I upload, and let me know what player, topic, team, or situation I could cover in my next one. Now, let's get started and grade all 14 starting SEC quarterbacks. So the first guy we're going to start with is Anthony Richardson. He's obviously the starting quarterback for the Florida Gators, and coming out of Gainesville, he was also a big-time recruit. The 4-star player of Richardson decided to redshirt in 2020, and he would play a little bit last year in 2021. While he had a couple of highlight plays, Dan Mullen refused to let him start, but Billy Napier decided to go all in and play Richardson this year. So far, he has passed for 1,839 yards with 9 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. He also has 492 yards on the ground and 8 touchdowns. Richardson has had a couple of great performances, including an upset victory over Utah, but he has struggled to be consistent. And while he has all the tools to be a great NFL quarterback, compared to the hype, I would give Richardson a C for now. Moving over to the SEC West, let's talk about Jackson Dart. Coming out of the state of Utah, Dart was a big-time recruit who was headed over to play for USC. He was part of the same recruiting class as Miller Moss, and both those guys would compete for the backup job. After Slovis would go down, Dart would come in and actually play decent. He threw for 1,300 yards with 9 touchdowns and 5 picks, and more importantly, had that it factor to him. USC was coming with a whole new staff, and they brought in Caleb Williams, so Dart entered the portal. After Matt Corral's spectacular 2021 campaign with Lane Kiffin, Dart decided to transfer to Ole Miss, where him and Luke Altmaier would both get a chance to play. Dart took over the job pretty quickly and led them to a great start. So far through the season, he has 1,911 yards with 14 touchdowns and 7 picks. He has 473 yards on the ground, but has not yet scored. While Dart's numbers, in my opinion, are a little bit underwhelming, he does have some decent wins, has shown flash, and definitely is not bad, so I'm going to give him a solid grade of a B. Up next, we have Jayden Daniels. Just like a lot of players on this list, Daniels was highly recruited coming out of high school. He was a borderline 5-star player and decided to commit to Herm Edwards at Arizona State. He won the job as a true freshman and threw for 3,000 yards with 17 touchdowns through the air. He was starting to build his NFL draft profile, but a bad 2020 season kind of halted that stock. Yes, they didn't play many games because of everything going on in the world, but 2021 was supposed to be his bounce back year. Instead, he was not great. He threw for 2,300 yards with 10 touchdowns and 10 picks and decided he needed a fresh start. After Max Johnson left for A&M, he would transfer over to LSU where he would try to win the starting job. He'd end up getting it, and so far through the season, he's thrown for 1,994 yards, 14 touchdowns and 1 pick, and has 10 scores and 600 yards on the ground. He's played great in all their big games, and most recently helped them upset Alabama. Early losses to Florida State and a blowout victory at Tennessee don't help, but right now, Daniels has been pretty dang good, has 24 touchdowns compared to just 1 turnover, is winning games, and for that, I'm going to give him an A-. This has been my first real chance to talk about Brady Cook on the channel. As many of you guys know, I'm a Mizzou fan. Coming out of St. Louis, Cook was never really seen as the guy, as he was only a 3-star player. After becoming a backup in 2020, he would start their bowl game against Army last year. He'd have 2 touchdowns in that game and would end up beating out Tyler Macon, Sam Horn, and Jack Abraham for the job this year. Fortunately though, Cook has been horrific. So far, he's thrown for 1,700 yards with 6 touchdowns and 7 picks. He does have 5 scores on the ground, and while the offensive line has been atrocious and the play calling has been pretty vanilla, Brady Cook is just not an SEC starting quarterback, and while he does have heart, I just don't know if he has what it takes to compete at this level, and for now, he gets a grade of a D-. Speaking of another player who's in a tough situation, let's talk about Robbie Ashford from Auburn. Going into the year, it looked like Calzada and Finley were going to be guys 1 and 2, but Ashford had a good spring. Except he didn't start out at Auburn. He was a big-time recruit coming out of high school and originally went to Oregon, but after getting buried on the depth chart, transferred to Auburn. Ashford was a guy who was a great athlete and was seen as more of a dual-threat player, and this year things have been interesting for him. He's thrown for 1,300 yards with 5 touchdowns and 5 picks, and then has 500 yards on the ground with 5 scores there. That means he has 10 touchdowns with 5 turnovers. Auburn's not winning games, and he hasn't looked comfortable there. Yes, the Auburn program is a complete dumpster fire right now, And while I think Ashford has the potential to be good, I think he got rushed into this and doesn't have a lot of help around him. But for a grade, we're going to give him a D. Staying in the state of Alabama, let's just go ahead and talk about Bryce Young. We all know the story. 5-star recruit committed to USC, but flipped to Nick Saban and sat behind Mac Jones in 2020. There's your quick summary of his career. Last year, he threw for nearly 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns and got his tie to the title game and won the Heisman along the way. Expectations were pretty high for him this year, and many did not think he would beat last year's numbers just because of how ridiculous they were. So far in the year, he's passed for 2,234 yards with 19 touchdowns and 4 picks and 3 more scores on the ground. Young was banged up for a couple of games, but right now he has losses to both Tennessee and LSU, and while in my opinion he's been spectacular and has made a lot of big time plays, having those 2 losses does not look good on your report card if you're a Bama quarterback. I think injuries are ultimately what has screwed over Young this year, but compared to the hype, I'm going to have to give him a B. Moving back over to the SEC East, I get the awesome opportunity to talk about Stetson Bennett again. Despite multiple big-time recruits on the roster, Stetson Bennett has always found a way to stick around. After coming into the school as a walk-on and going the junior college route, he became the 4th string in 2020, but his name would get called against Arkansas, and he'd throw for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. Last year, after JT Daniels had his weird injury saga, Bennett would take over, throwing for 29 touchdowns and nearly 3,000 yards, en route to a Georgia national championship. He decided to use his extra year of eligibility, and at 25 years old, he's thrown for 2,606 yards with 11 touchdowns and 3 picks and 6 more scores on the ground. While his numbers aren't going to jump off the page, Georgia's been blowing up pretty much every team. They are primarily a running team, so Stetson doesn't have to do a whole lot. Compared to the hype and what everyone thinks of Stetson, I think he's playing exactly how we expected. He elevated his game this past weekend against Tennessee, and while his numbers probably could be a lot better, he's doing exactly what Georgia and the coaching staff is asking of him, and he's undefeated, so I have to give him an A. Moving back over to the SEC West, let's talk about Mississippi State's quarterback, Will Rogers. He was an underrated 3-star recruit coming out of high school and would get an opportunity to start the back half of the 2020 season. He threw for 2,000 yards and 11 touchdowns, and everyone saw there was a lot of potential for him. He became the full-fledged starter in 2021, throwing for nearly 5,000 yards with 36 touchdowns and 9 picks. This season, as the favorite to lead the conference in passing yards, and so far that's what he's doing. He has nearly 3,000 yards passing with 26 touchdowns and 5 picks. There'd probably be a decent amount of Heisman hype for him, but Mississippi State can't seem to win enough games, and it doesn't seem the Bulldogs get a lot of national attention, so once again Rogers is going under the radar. He's right on par with expectations for him, and he's playing his way into the NFL, so I'm going to have to give Rogers an A. Moving back to the SEC East, we're going to have to talk about AJ Swann. What's interesting is this guy was the 3rd string going into the year. It looked like either Ken Seals or Mike Wright were going to be the week 0 starter, and it ended up being Wright. Mike Wright had a tremendous first game against Hawaii, but after he struggled, true freshman AJ Swann would take over. He was a 4-star coming out of high school, and Swann has showed that potential. So far, he has 1,195 yards with 10 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, but he is currently hurt. No one expected Vanderbilt to win anything or for a Vanderbilt quarterback to do well, but I'd actually say Swann has done really well for his situation. At times has looked like a future star and actually has decent numbers, so I'm going to give Swann a B+ for his performance so far. What's holding him back is the lack of wins. Before we get to our last 5 quarterbacks, be sure to hit that like button and leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of today's video so far. Now let's talk about Will Levis. Coming from Connecticut, Levis was only a 3-star recruit and got an offer to play for Penn State, which he happily accepted. After becoming Sean Clifford's backup, Levis would start a couple of games, but Penn State did not see enough in him that they really wanted to keep him around. He decided to transfer to Kentucky, where he'd beat out Joey Gatewood for the starting job in 2021. Last year, Levis passed for 2,826 yards with 24 touchdowns and 13 picks. This is the classic case of a player who, in my opinion, was extremely overhyped for no reason. I mean, the guy had 13 turnovers. Yes, he has some intangibles and physical traits that could translate to the NFL, but I just didn't understand the hype. Going into this year, though, I was going to give him a chance. So far, he has 1,903 yards with 16 touchdowns and 8 picks. He's still struggling with turnovers. Kentucky is having a semi-disappointing season, and in my eyes, he just isn't that impressive. I have no reason to dislike Kentucky or Levis, but I just think the guy's a little bit overrated. Still, though, he hasn't been terrible, and many believe he's still a first-round talent, so I'm going to give him a B- for his grade. Moving over to the SEC West, we're now going to talk about Haynes King. He was a big-time Texas high school football prospect and when he arrived at A&M, some were calling him Johnny Manziel 2.0. He redshirted in 2020 before taking over as a starter in 2021. He threw 2 touchdowns and 3 picks before he would get hurt for the season against Colorado. Going into this year, he'd bounce back and win the quarterback job, but he has not been great. He's thrown for 1,220 yards with 7 touchdowns and 6 picks. He has 1 score on the ground, and while at times he's made some big plays, for the most part he has struggled and probably wouldn't be playing right now if Max Johnson didn't get hurt. I'm also only going with King because he's played the most, as right now it looks like A&M is going in the direction of Connor Weigman. Either way though, King has been disappointing in his 3 years in College Station, and for his performance this year, I'm going to give him a D. Let's talk about KJ Jefferson. Many have been calling him Cam Newton 2.0 and an underrated quarterback prospect for the 23 draft. After a breakout season last year, in which he threw for 2,676 yards with 21 touchdowns and 4 picks, Jefferson was expected to lead Arkansas to a big season. Combining an injury with a little bit of overhype and a tough schedule, his passing numbers are down as he only has 1,981 yards, but he does have 17 touchdowns and only 3 picks. He also has 400 yards on the ground and 6 scores, and Jefferson is slowly getting back to last year's form. While Jefferson's profile has kind of gone down, he's quietly had a good year, and in my opinion, he gets a B+. Tennessee was the shocking story of the 2022 season until they lost this past weekend to Georgia, and while they still have an outside chance of getting in the playoff, it's probably not going to happen. A big reason for that was Hendon Hooker. After coming out of high school as a 4-star player, Hooker would start on and off for the 2019 and 2020 seasons at Virginia Tech before he'd look for a new home. He originally became the backup to Joe Milton at Tennessee, but would take over and have a magnificent 2021 campaign. He threw for nearly 3,000 yards with 31 touchdowns and 3 picks. This year he had dark horse Heisman hype, and he turned it into legitimate Heisman hype. He beat teams such as LSU, Alabama, Kentucky, and Pittsburgh, and he threw for 2,533 yards, and he's thrown for 2,533 yards with 21 touchdowns and 2 picks. Unfortunately, that loss to Georgia is going to hurt his Heisman hype, but he's played his way onto the NFL draft radar, is leading Tennessee to a historic season, and has been a lot of fun to watch, so he's going to get an A for this season, and you could argue before the Georgia game, he'd have an A+. You guys all knew I was going to save the best for last, and that is Spencer Rattler. Coming out of high school as a 5-star player, Rattler had all the hype in the world. He took over as a starter at Oklahoma in 2020, where he threw for 3,000 yards, 28 touchdowns, and 7 picks. Because of that, Oklahoma and Rattler had unreal hype going into 2021, but after he struggled, he was benched in favor of Caleb Williams, the whole staff left for USC, and Rattler left for the other USC. We're talking about South Carolina. He rejoined with Shane Beamer, brought his tight end along with him, and was ready for a fresh start. So far for the 2022 season, Carolina has a 6-3 record, but Rattler has not been very impressive. He's thrown for 1,800 yards with 8 touchdowns and 9 picks, and has 3 scores on the ground. South Carolina is a really strange team this year, as they just lost at home to Missouri, but they also went on the road and beat Kentucky. You really never know what you're going to get with them, but Rattler is not the primary reason for their success. He hasn't been terrible, but he hasn't been great either. Let's take away all that blind hype and be honest with ourselves and say this is about what we all expected Rattler to do this year. While his numbers have been down, he is at a 6-3 record, so I'm going to give him a C+. But what do you guys think? I just graded all 14 SEC quarterbacks, and I'm sure you guys are angry at some of my takes, so be sure to let me know down below what you think, who your favorite SEC quarterback is, and what player, topic, team, or situation I could take a look at next. Also be sure to leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.